On a Tuesday evening in late June, Julian Cross sat in seat 32B of Skyrise Airlines Flight 447 from Chicago O'Hare to Seattle Tacoma, squeezed between a college student who had fallen asleep against the window and a businessman who was aggressively man-spreading into Julian's leg space and heard the flight attendant say something to her colleague that would ultimately cost Skyrise Airlines its independence, its board of directors, and its reputation as one of America's most trusted regional carriers. The comment was delivered in a stage whisper, the kind that was meant to be overheard by some people and not others, and it came as the flight attendant, whose name tag read Stephanie Holcomb, leaned toward another attendant near the galley and said, loud enough for Julian and the 3 rows around him to hear, "I do not know why they even let people like him book seats if they cannot afford to fly properly." Julian, who was worth $3.2 billion, and could have bought every seat on the plane 1,000 times over, who had chosen to fly economy specifically because he wanted to experience what most of his employees experienced when they traveled, who had spent the last 15 years building a technology empire from a dorm room at Northwestern to a publicly traded company with offices in 12 countries, felt something inside him go very still and very cold. Julian Cross was 47 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with skin the color of dark mahogany and a face that his wife Nadia said looked like it had been carved from stone when he was angry. He wore his hair in short locks that were starting to show traces of silver, and he had a quiet intensity about him that made people take him seriously even when he was not saying much. He had grown up on the south side of Chicago, the youngest of 3 children raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep them fed and housed. He had earned a full scholarship to Northwestern, studied computer science and business, and had started his first company at 23. That company, a data analytics firm called Apex Insights, had been acquired by Google for $80 million when Julian was 28. He had used that money to start his second company, CrossTech Solutions, which built enterprise software for supply chain management and had grown into a behemoth with annual revenues exceeding $4 billion. Julian had taken CrossTech public 3 years earlier, and his personal stake in the company, combined with his investments in real estate, venture capital, and a portfolio of other businesses, put his net worth somewhere north of $3 billion, though the exact number fluctuated with the market, and Julian had stopped paying attention to it years ago. He flew commercial regularly, usually in first class or business, but occasionally when he wanted to stay grounded or when he was testing the experience his employees faced during company travel, he would book economy. He believed that if you ran a company with 5,000 employees, many of whom flew coach for work trips, you should know what that experience felt like. You should sit in the cramped seats, eat the mediocre snacks, wait in the long bathroom lines, and understand the indignities that came with being treated as cargo rather than as a customer. So when Julian had booked his flight from Chicago to Seattle for a board meeting with one of his portfolio companies, he had deliberately chosen economy, aisle seat with no upgrades. He had checked in online, printed his boarding pass, and shown up at O'Hare with a small carry-on and a backpack, looking like any other traveler in jeans and a black t-shirt. The flight had boarded normally. Julian had found his seat, stowed his bag, and settled in with a book, a biography of Reginald Lewis that he had been meaning to read for months. The plane was full, the cabin warm and noisy with the sounds of passengers shuffling bags and arguing over armrests. Julian had nodded politely to his seatmates, both of whom had ignored him, and he had been fine with that. He was not looking for conversation. He was looking for 2.5 hours of quiet reading before landing in Seattle and diving into back-to-back meetings that would consume the next 3 days. But about 20 minutes into the flight, after the plane had reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign had dinged off, Julian had pressed the call button to ask for a bottle of water. He had not eaten much that day, just a protein bar grabbed between meetings, and he was starting to feel dehydrated. The call button light had blinked above his head for a full 3 minutes before anyone responded. Finally, Stephanie Holcomb had appeared. A white woman in her mid-30s with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun and an expression that suggested she found Julian's existence inconvenient. "Yes," Stephanie had said. Her tone clipped. "Could I get a bottle of water, please?" Julian had asked, keeping his voice polite. Stephanie had looked at him for a long moment, her eyes travelling from his face down to his clothes and back up again, as if she was cataloguing every detail and finding all of it wanting. "Water costs $4, she had said. "That is fine," Julian had replied. "I will pay. Do you have a credit card?" "I do. We only take credit cards, no cash." "That is fine. I have a card." Stephanie had sighed, a small, exasperated sound, and had said, "I will be back," in a tone that suggested she would not, in fact, be back any time soon. She had walked away, and Julian had waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Julian had watched Stephanie move through the cabin, stopping to chat with passengers in the front rows, laughing at something a man in a business suit had said, handing out pillows and blankets to a family with small children. She had not looked in Julian's direction once. After 15 minutes, Julian had pressed the call button again. This time, a different flight attendant had appeared, a young Latino man whose name tag read Miguel. Miguel had smiled apologetically. "Sorry for the wait. What can I get you?" "A bottle of water," Julian had said. "I asked the other attendant about 15 minutes ago, but she has not come back." Miguel had glanced toward the galley where Stephanie was standing, then back at Julian. "No problem. Let me grab that for you. That will be $4. Julian had handed over his credit card, and Miguel had processed the payment on a handheld device and returned with a small bottle of water and a receipt. Julian had thanked him, and Miguel had moved on. Julian had opened the bottle, taken a long drink, and had gone back to his book, trying to shake off the irritation that was starting to build in his chest. He told himself it was nothing. Flight attendants were busy. Stephanie had probably just forgotten. It was not personal. But then, 30 minutes later, it had happened. Julian had gotten up to use the bathroom, and when he had returned to his seat, he had found Stephanie and another flight attendant, an older white woman with grey hair and a name tag that read Carol, standing near the galley in the back of the plane. They were talking in low voices, and Julian, walking down the aisle toward his seat, had heard Stephanie say, "I swear, Coach is getting worse every year. I had to deal with this guy in 32B who acted like I was his personal servant, rang the call button twice for water. Water like you are in economy, dude. Lower your expectations." Carol had laughed, a sharp sound. "I know the type. They think they deserve first-class treatment on a coach ticket." And then Stephanie, glancing toward Julian as he approached, had leaned closer to Carol and said, just loud enough for Julian to hear, "I do not know why they even let people like him book seats if they cannot afford to fly properly." The words had hung in the air for a fraction of a second, and then Stephanie had noticed Julian standing there, his face carefully blank, and her expression had shifted, not to embarrassment or regret, but to something harder. Defiance, maybe, or annoyance that she had been overheard. She had straightened, brushed past Julian without a word, and had disappeared toward the front of the cabin. Carol had avoided Julian's eyes and had busied herself with restocking cups. Julian had stood there for a moment, the narrow aisle pressing in on him, the noise of the plane suddenly very loud. People like him. The phrase echoed in his head, and he knew exactly what it meant. He had heard variations of it his entire life. People like you. People like them. It was code, a way of saying black without saying black, a way of othering someone without being explicit enough to be called out. And Stephanie had said it casually, comfortably, as if Julian was not a person standing 3 feet away but an object, a problem, something to be managed and dismissed. Julian had walked back to his seat, sat down, and had stared at the seat back in front of him for the rest of the flight. He had not read another page of his book. He had not closed his eyes. He had just sat there thinking about the fact that he was a billionaire who employed 5,000 people, who paid millions in taxes every year, who had donated tens of millions to scholarships and community programs and causes he believed in, and he was still being treated like he did not belong. Thinking about the fact that his money, his success, his reputation, none of it mattered in this moment. To Stephanie Holcomb, he was just another black man in economy, someone who needed to lower his expectations, and that realization, more than the comment itself, was what made Julian decide that this was not going to stand. If you have ever been dismissed, if you have ever been made to feel like you did not belong in a space you had every right to occupy, hit that like button, because what Julian did next was not about revenge. It was about accountability on a scale that most people could not imagine. The plane landed in Seattle at 9:30 in the evening, Pacific time. Julian deplaned, collected his luggage, and took a car service to his hotel, the Four Seasons downtown. He checked in, went up to his suite, and sat on the edge of the bed, still in his travel clothes, and thought about what he wanted to do. His first instinct was to call Skyrise Airlines customer service, file a complaint, and let the system handle it. But Julian had been through enough corporate complaint processes to know how they worked. The complaint would be logged, someone would send him a form apology and maybe a voucher for a future flight, and Stephanie Holcomb would get a slap on the wrist if she got anything at all. The system was designed to protect employees, to smooth over incidents, to make problems go away quietly. And Julian did not want this to go away quietly. He opened his laptop and started researching Skyrise Airlines. He knew the airline by reputation, a mid-sized regional carrier based in Denver that operated routes across the western United States. Skyrise was not one of the big legacy carriers like United or Delta, but it was not a budget airline either. It occupied a middle space, marketing itself as affordable but comfortable, with better service than the discount carriers and lower prices than the majors. The airline had been around for about 20 years, had a fleet of about 60 aircraft, and employed roughly 4,000 people. It was profitable, though not spectacularly so, with annual revenues around $2 billion. And, Julian discovered as he dug deeper, it was publicly traded, with a market capitalization of about $1.4 billion. Julian sat back and looked at that number. $1.4 billion. He could afford that. Not easily, and not without some financial maneuvering, but he could do it. He had liquid assets of around $800 million, investments he could liquidate for another $1 billion, and access to credit lines that would cover the rest. If he wanted to, he could buy Skyrise Airlines outright, take it private, and do whatever he wanted with it. The idea was absurd. It was excessive. It was exactly the kind of billionaire power move that people made movies about. But the more Julian thought about it, the more it made sense. Not as revenge, though revenge was part of it, but as a statement, as a way of saying that discrimination had consequences, that you could not treat people like they did not matter and expect the world to stay the same. Julian had spent his entire career fighting for respect, for a seat at the table, for the right to be taken seriously, and here was a chance to flip the script entirely. To take an airline that had dismissed him and turn it into something better, to make sure that what had happened to him did not happen to anyone else. He called Nadia. It was nearly midnight in Chicago, but she answered on the second ring, her voice groggy but alert. "Julian? Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Sorry to wake you, but I need to run something by you." "Okay. What is it?" Julian told her the story, the flight, the attendant, the comment. Nadia listened without interrupting, and when Julian finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "That is terrible," she said finally. "I am so sorry, baby. What do you want to do?" "I want to buy the airline." Nadia laughed, then stopped when she realized Julian was not joking. "Wait, you are serious?" "I am." "Julian, you cannot buy an airline because one flight attendant was rude to you." "It is not about her being rude. It is about the fact that this kind of thing happens every day, to me and to millions of other people, and nothing changes. I have the resources to actually do something about it. So why not? Because it is insane. Because buying an airline is not like buying a car or a house. It is a massive undertaking. It is regulatory approval and union negotiations and operational headaches and a million things you have never dealt with before. I know, but I have built companies before. I know how to hire the right people, how to structure deals, how to navigate complexity, and I have got the money. So why not? Nadia sighed. Okay, let us say you are serious. What is your end game? You buy the airline, you fire the flight attendant, and then what? You run an airline? You, Julian Cross, technology guy, are going to run an airline? I do not need to run it. I need to own it. I need to set the culture, put the right leadership in place, and make sure that what happened to me does not keep happening. And then, if it works, I sell it, or I keep it. I have not figured that part out yet. This is crazy. Maybe. But I am going to do it anyway. Nadia was quiet again. Then she said, All right. If you are serious, you need to talk to your financial advisors. You need to talk to a lawyer who specializes in acquisitions. You need to make sure this is even possible before you go down this road. Promise me you will do that before you make any moves. I promise. And Julian? Be careful. People are going to say you are being petty, that you are using your money to bully people. You need to be ready for that. I know, but I would rather be called petty than let this slide. They talked for a few more minutes and then Julian let Nadia go back to sleep. He spent the rest of the night on his laptop, pulling financial reports, reading analyst coverage of Skyrise, and mapping out what an acquisition would look like. By the time the sun came up over Seattle, Julian had a plan. It was rough, full of unknowns and variables, but it was a plan, and Julian Cross had built a career on turning rough plans into reality. The next morning, Julian called his attorney, a man named Marcus Delaney, who had been handling Julian's corporate legal work for over a decade. Marcus was based in Chicago, a partner at a major firm, and he specialized in mergers and acquisitions. Julian reached him at his office at 8 in the morning, Central Time. Julian, good morning. What can I do for you? I need you to start looking into the process for acquiring a publicly traded airline, specifically Skyrise Airlines. I want to know what it would take to buy a controlling stake or take it private. There was a pause. Skyrise, the regional carrier. That is the one. Can I ask why? Julian gave him the short version. Marcus listened, and when Julian finished, he said, Okay, that is unfortunate. But Julian, buying an airline is a massive undertaking. It is not just the purchase price. It is regulatory approval from the DOT and the FAA. It is union negotiations. It is integration challenges. And it is going to take months, maybe a year or more. Are you sure this is the move you want to make? I am sure. All right. Then let me start pulling information. I will need a few days to get you a preliminary assessment. But Julian, I have to tell you, this is going to be expensive, and it is going to be public. The moment you start buying shares, people are going to notice. You are going to be in the news. You need to be ready for that. I am ready. Okay. I will call you in a few days. Julian hung up and went about his day, attending the board meetings he had flown to Seattle for, smiling and shaking hands and discussing quarterly projections and growth strategies. But his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Skyrise, about how to structure the deal, about what he would do once he owned it. And he was thinking about Stephanie Holcomb, wondering if she had any idea what she had set in motion. 3 days later, Marcus called back with a preliminary report. Julian was back in Chicago by then, sitting in his office on the 40th floor of a glass tower in the Loop, looking out over Lake Michigan. Okay, Marcus said, I have got some information for you. Skyrise Airlines is publicly traded on NASDAQ under the ticker SKR. Current market cap is about 1.38 billion, down slightly from when you first asked me to look into this. The company has about 60 million shares outstanding, trading at around $23 a share. If you want to acquire a controlling stake, you are looking at buying at least 31 million shares, which would give you 51%. At current prices, that is about $712 million. But here is the thing. The moment you start buying shares in large quantities, the price is going to go up. So you are probably looking at closer to 900 million to a billion for a controlling stake. That is manageable, Julian said. Right, but there is more. Skyrise has a staggered board, which means you cannot just buy shares and take control immediately. You would need to wait for the next board election, or you would need to launch a proxy fight to replace the board. Either way, it is going to take time. And then there is the regulatory side. Any change of control in an airline triggers a review by the Department of Transportation. They are going to want to make sure you have the financial resources to run the airline, that you are not going to strip it for parts, and that the acquisition is in the public interest. That process can take 6 months to a year. What if I make a tender offer? Buy all the shares at a premium and take the company private? That is an option, but it is going to be expensive. You would need to offer a premium of at least 20 to 30% over the current share price to get shareholders to sell. So instead of 1.38 billion, you are looking at 1.8 to 2 billion. And you still have to go through the DOT review. Julian thought about it. 2 billion was a lot of money, even for him, but it was doable. He would need to liquidate some investments, take on some debt, but it was doable. And the regulatory process, while slow, was not an insurmountable obstacle. Julian had dealt with government agencies before. You just needed to be patient and thorough. All right, Julian said. Start drafting the paperwork for a tender offer. I want to offer $28 a share, which is a roughly 20% premium. And I want to structure this so that I am buying the company outright, taking it private, with the intention of restructuring operations and management. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You are really doing this? I am really doing this. Okay, I will get started. But Julian, one more thing. You need to think about the optics. The moment this goes public, people are going to ask why a tech billionaire is buying an airline. Some people are going to say it is because of what happened on that flight, and they are going to call you petty or vindictive. You need a narrative that explains this in a way that makes sense to investors and the public. The narrative is simple. I am buying an airline that has lost its way, that has stopped prioritizing customer service and employee culture, and I am going to fix it. I am going to make it a model for how airlines should treat people, how they should train their staff, and how they should operate. And if that happens to address some personal experience I had, well, that is just a bonus. That is good. I can work with that. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus and his team put together the tender offer. It was a complex document, full of legal language and financial projections. But the core was simple. Julian Cross was offering to buy all outstanding shares of Skyrise Airlines for $28 per share, a total valuation of approximately $1.68 billion. The offer was contingent on regulatory approval and a minimum of 90% of shareholders tendering their shares. Julian would finance the acquisition through a combination of personal funds, liquidated investments, and a credit facility from JP Chase. Once the acquisition was complete, Julian would take the company private, install a new board of directors, and begin a comprehensive review of operations with the goal of improving customer service, employee training, and corporate culture. The tender offer was filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission on a Monday morning in mid-July. By Monday afternoon, it was all over the news. Bloomberg ran a headline: Tech billionaire Julian Cross bids to acquire Skyrise Airlines for $1.68 billion. CNBC covered it on their evening broadcast, speculating about Julian's motives and whether he had the operational experience to run an airline. The Wall Street Journal published an analysis questioning whether the price was fair and whether shareholders would accept the offer. And social media exploded with takes, ranging from supportive to skeptical to outright hostile. Some people praised Julian for taking a stand, for using his wealth to address discrimination and to hold corporations accountable. Others said he was being ridiculous, that buying an entire airline because of one bad experience was the definition of petty billionaire nonsense. And still others saw it as a savvy business move, a way for Julian to diversify his portfolio and enter a new industry. Julian ignored most of it. He had learned a long time ago that once you were in the public eye, everyone had an opinion about you, and most of those opinions were based on incomplete information and personal bias. What mattered was executing the plan. The tender offer period lasted 30 days, during which shareholders could decide whether to accept Julian's offer or hold on to their shares. During that time, Julian did a series of interviews to explain his vision for Skyrise. He appeared on CNBC, where the host asked him point-blank if this was about revenge. "No," Julian said, looking directly into the camera. "This is about accountability. I had an experience on a Skyrise flight that made it clear to me that the airline has a culture problem. Flight attendants should not be making derogatory comments about passengers. Customers should not be treated differently based on how they look or where they are sitting. And if the current leadership is not addressing those issues, then maybe it is time for new leadership. But buying an entire airline seems extreme," the host said. "Maybe, but I have the resources to do it, and I believe I can make a difference. I have built companies before. I know how to create a positive culture, how to train employees, how to set standards, and I think Skyrise can be a model for the industry if it is run the right way." The interview went viral, and suddenly Julian was not just a billionaire making a power move, he was a symbol. People started sharing their own stories of discrimination on airlines, of being profiled or dismissed or treated poorly because of their race. The hashtag Skyrise Accountability started trending, and advocacy groups began calling for broader reforms across the airline industry. Julian had not set out to start a movement, but that was what was happening, and he was okay with it. Because the more attention this got, the harder it would be for Skyrise to ignore the problem. By the end of the tender offer period, 87% of Skyrise shareholders had accepted Julian's offer. It was not the 90% he had hoped for, but it was enough. The board of directors, recognizing that they had lost the confidence of their shareholders, agreed to negotiate with Julian. Over the course of 2 weeks, the lawyers hammered out the details, and in early September the deal was announced. Julian Cross had acquired Skyrise Airlines for $1.68 billion. The company would be taken private, and Julian would assume the role of chairman and CEO, with a mandate to restructure operations and rebuild the airline's reputation. The reaction was mixed. Skyrise employees were nervous, unsure what a tech billionaire taking over meant for their jobs and their futures. Aviation industry analysts were skeptical, questioning whether Julian had the expertise to run an airline. But passengers, at least those who had been following the story, were cautiously optimistic. Maybe, they thought, this would be the push the industry needed to start treating people better. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that real change requires bold action, because what Julian did next would test every assumption people had about corporate leadership, accountability, and whether one person could actually transform an entire company culture from the top down. Julian's first day as CEO of Skyrise Airlines was September 15th, a Wednesday. He arrived at the company's headquarters in Denver at 7 in the morning, dressed in a suit and carrying a leather briefcase, and was met by the outgoing CEO, a man named Robert Finch, who had been running Skyrise for the past 6 years. Robert was in his early 60s, white, with thinning hair and a permanent expression of mild exasperation. He had agreed to stay on for 2 weeks to facilitate the transition, though it was clear from his body language that he was not happy about any of this. "Mr. Cross," Robert said, shaking Julian's hand with minimal enthusiasm. "Welcome to Skyrise. I have cleared my office for you. Let me show you around." Robert walked Julian through the headquarters, a nondescript office building near the Denver airport. The space was functional but uninspiring, full of cubicles and fluorescent lights and the low hum of phones and computers. Robert introduced Julian to the senior leadership team, the chief operating officer, a woman named Linda Hartman, the chief financial officer, a man named Steve Park, the VP of Human Resources, a woman named Angela Winters, and the VP of Customer Experience, a man named Tom Briggs. They all smiled and shook Julian's hand and said the right things, but Julian could see the wariness in their eyes. They were wondering what he was going to do, whether their jobs were safe, whether this tech billionaire had any idea what he was getting into. Julian spent the first week listening. He sat in on meetings, reviewed financial reports, toured maintenance facilities and airport hubs, and talked to employees at every level of the organization. He spoke with pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, mechanics, and customer service reps. He asked them about their jobs, their challenges, their frustrations, and what he heard was a consistent theme. Skyrise had lost its way. The company had been so focused on cutting costs and maximizing profits that it had stopped investing in its people. Training budgets had been slashed, employee benefits had been reduced, customer service standards had slipped, and the culture had become one of resignation, where employees did the bare minimum because they did not feel valued or supported. Julian also requested the personnel file for Stephanie Holcomb, the flight attendant who had made the comment that started all of this. The file revealed that Stephanie had been with Skyrise for 8 years, had generally positive performance reviews, and had no formal complaints on record. There were a few informal notes in her file about customer interactions that had required manager intervention, but nothing that had resulted in discipline. It was exactly what Julian had expected. The system had failed. Stephanie had been allowed to operate without accountability because no one was paying attention. On his 8th day as CEO, Julian called an all-hands meeting. It was held via video conference, with employees from every hub and facility dialing in. There were about 4,000 people on the call, and Julian knew that this moment mattered. This was his chance to set the tone, to explain his vision, and to make it clear that things were going to change. "Good morning, everyone," Julian began, looking into the camera. "My name is Julian Cross, and as most of you know, I recently acquired Skyrise Airlines. I want to start by saying that I did not buy this company to strip it for parts or to make a quick profit. I bought it because I believe it can be better. I believe that Skyrise can be a model for how airlines treat their employees and their customers. But to get there, we need to make some changes." He paused, letting that sink in. "I'm not going to lie to you. Some of these changes are going to be hard. We are going to be raising standards. We are going to be investing in training. We are going to be holding people accountable for how they treat others. And for some of you, that might feel uncomfortable. But I also want to be clear about something. I am not here to punish anyone. I am here to build something better, and I need your help to do that." Julian went on to outline his priorities. First, employee training. Every employee, from flight attendants to pilots to gate agents, would go through a comprehensive training program focused on customer service, unconscious bias, and conflict resolution. Second, accountability. Skyrise would implement a transparent complaint system where passengers and employees could report issues, and those reports would be investigated thoroughly. Third, investment. Julian was committing $100 million over the next 2 years to improve employee benefits, upgrade facilities, and modernize the fleet. And fourth, culture. Skyrise would establish a set of core values centered on respect, dignity, and excellence, and those values would be lived, not just printed on posters. The reaction to the all-hands meeting was cautiously positive. Some employees were skeptical, having heard promises before, but others were intrigued, and a few were genuinely excited. Julian knew that talk was cheap. He needed to follow through. The first major action Julian took was to terminate Stephanie Holcomb's employment. He did not do it himself. That would have been inappropriate and legally risky. Instead, he had Angela Winters, the VP of Human Resources, conduct a formal investigation. Angela pulled the flight records from Julian's flight, interviewed the other attendants who had been working that day, and reviewed the onboard camera footage. Skyrise aircraft did not have audio recording in the cabin for privacy reasons, but the video footage corroborated Julian's account. It showed Stephanie and Carol speaking in the galley, Stephanie gesturing toward Julian's seat, and Julian standing nearby. The other flight attendant, Miguel, confirmed in his interview that he had heard Stephanie make derogatory comments about passengers in the past, though he had never reported it because he did not think anyone would care. Based on the investigation, Angela determined that Stephanie had violated Skyrise's code of conduct, which prohibited discriminatory behavior toward passengers. Stephanie was called into a meeting, presented with the findings, and terminated for cause. She protested, saying that Julian was retaliating against her, that the investigation was biased, and that she was being made a scapegoat. But the evidence was clear, and Angela stood firm. Stephanie was escorted out of the building, and her termination was documented in her personnel file. Julian did not feel good about it. He took no pleasure in the fact that someone had lost their job, but he also knew that accountability mattered. If Stephanie had been allowed to stay, it would have sent a message to every other employee that the new standards were not real, that the talk about culture change was just talk, and Julian could not afford to let that happen. The termination was reported in the media, because of course it was. Some outlets framed it as Julian exacting revenge, as a billionaire using his power to destroy someone's livelihood over a single comment. Others framed it as accountability, as a company finally taking discrimination seriously. Julian did not respond to any of it. He had learned that once the narrative was out there, trying to control it was a losing battle. All you could do was keep moving forward. Over the next few months, Julian threw himself into the work of transforming Skyrise. He hired a consulting firm specializing in organizational culture to design the new training program. The program was comprehensive, involving 2 full days of workshops for every employee, covering topics like implicit bias, active listening, conflict de-escalation, and customer empathy. The workshops were mandatory, and employees who did not complete them would not be allowed to work customer-facing roles. There was some pushback, particularly from employees who felt that the training was unnecessary or patronizing. But Julian made it clear that this was non-negotiable. If you worked for Skyrise, you completed the training, period. Julian also overhauled the complaint system. The old system had been opaque and slow, with complaints funneled through multiple layers of management and often disappearing into bureaucratic limbo. The new system was simple and transparent. Passengers and employees could submit complaints online or via a dedicated phone line, and every complaint was logged in a central database. Each complaint was assigned to an investigator within 48 hours, and the investigator was required to follow up with the complainant within a week. Serious complaints, those involving discrimination or safety, were escalated to senior leadership. And every quarter, Julian personally reviewed a sample of complaints to make sure the system was working. The fleet upgrades were more complex. Skyrise's aircraft were aging, and many of them needed significant maintenance and refurbishment. Julian allocated $50 million to retrofit the interiors, replacing worn seats, upgrading entertainment systems, and improving cabin lighting. Another $30 million went to engine overhauls and safety upgrades, and $20 million was set aside for employee facilities, improving break rooms, updating uniforms, and providing better equipment for ground crews. It was a massive investment, and it put a dent in Julian's personal finances, but he believed it was necessary. You could not ask employees to deliver excellent service if you were not giving them the tools to do it. The changes did not happen overnight. There were setbacks and resistance. Some employees quit, saying they did not want to work for a company that was being run by someone who did not understand the airline industry. A few union leaders pushed back against the new training requirements, arguing that they were an overreach and that employees were being treated like they were the problem. And there were operational hiccups. Flights delayed because of new procedures, customer complaints about changes to onboard service. But slowly, things started to improve. Customer satisfaction scores began to tick upward. Employee morale, as measured by quarterly surveys, started to rise, and the incidence of discrimination complaints, while not eliminated, dropped by 30% in the first 6 months under Julian's leadership. Julian's second major personnel decision came 6 months into his tenure. He fired Robert Finch's entire senior leadership team, not because they were bad people, but because they were too entrenched in the old way of doing things. Linda Hartman, the COO, had been with Skyrise for 15 years and had presided over the cost-cutting measures that had gutted employee benefits. Steve Park, the CFO, had pushed for policies that prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability. Tom Briggs, the VP of Customer Experience, had let complaint systems languish because addressing them was expensive. They were all competent in their own way, but they were not the people who could lead Skyrise into the future Julian envisioned. Replacing them was not easy. Julian needed people who understood the airline industry, but who also shared his vision for culture and accountability. He hired a new COO from Southwest Airlines, a woman named Keisha Monroe, who had a reputation for operational excellence and employee engagement. He hired a new CFO from a private equity firm, a man named David Nguyen, who had experience restructuring distressed companies. And he promoted Angela Winters to Chief People Officer, a new position that combined HR with culture and training. Angela had been one of the few holdovers from the old regime who had embraced Julian's vision, and he trusted her to execute it. With the new team in place, Julian started to think about the longer-term strategy. He did not want to just fix Skyrise. He wanted to transform it into something that the industry would look at and say, that is how it should be done. He wanted Skyrise to be known for treating people well, for having the best trained staff, for setting the standard. And he wanted to prove that you could do all of that and still be profitable. One of the key initiatives was a program called Elevate, which was designed to give employees a direct stake in the company's success. Since Skyrise was now privately held, Julian could not offer stock options in the traditional sense, but he structured a profit-sharing plan where 20% of annual profits would be distributed to employees based on tenure and performance. It was a significant investment, potentially tens of millions of dollars a year, but Julian believed it was worth it. If employees felt like they were part of something bigger, if they felt like their work mattered and was rewarded, they would care more. They would deliver better service, and that would drive customer loyalty and revenue growth. The Elevate program launched in January of the following year, and the response was overwhelming. Employees who had been skeptical of Julian, who had seen him as just another billionaire playing with a toy, started to come around. They saw the investments, the training, the profit sharing, and they realized that maybe this guy was serious. Maybe he really did care about making Skyrise better. By the end of Julian's first year as CEO, Skyrise Airlines looked very different from the company he had acquired. Customer satisfaction scores had increased by 18%. Employee turnover had dropped by 25%. On-time performance had improved, and the airline was profitable, with revenues up 7% year over year. The transformation was not complete. There were still challenges and areas for improvement, but the trajectory was undeniable. Skyrise was getting better, but not everyone was happy. There was a contingent of former executives, shareholders, and industry insiders who resented Julian for what he had done. They saw him as an outsider who had swooped in, thrown his weight around, and disrupted a functioning company for personal reasons. They said he was wasting money on feel-good initiatives that did not move the needle. They said he did not understand the airline business and that his success was a fluke. And they said, quietly and not so quietly, that the only reason he had been able to pull this off was because of political correctness, because criticizing a black billionaire would make you look racist. Julian heard the whispers, saw the op-eds, read the comments, and he did not care, because the results spoke for themselves. Skyrise was better, the employees were happier, the customers were more satisfied, and the company was making money. If people wanted to attribute that to luck or political correctness, that was their problem. Julian knew what he had done, and he knew it was working. In the spring of his second year as CEO, Julian decided to do something bold. He announced that Skyrise would implement a policy requiring all senior executives, including himself, to fly an economy at least once a quarter. The policy was designed to ensure that leadership understood the customer experience, that they were not insulated in first-class cabins making decisions about economy passengers they never interacted with. It was a symbolic gesture, but it was also practical. If you were going to run an airline, you needed to know what it felt like to be crammed into a middle seat for 3 hours. The policy was met with some grumbling from executives who were used to the perks of their positions. But Julian was firm. If you did not want to fly economy, you could find another job. And to his credit, most of the executives complied. They flew economy, they talked to passengers, they experienced the delays and the cramped seats and the mediocre food. And they came back with ideas for how to make things better. Julian also used those flights as opportunities to observe. He would book a seat under a pseudonym, dress casually, and see how the staff interacted with passengers. Most of the time, the interactions were fine. Flight attendants were professional, courteous, doing their jobs, but occasionally he would see behavior that concerned him. A gate agent being short with a passenger who did not speak English well. A flight attendant rolling their eyes at a family with a crying baby. Small things, but things that mattered. And each time Julian would document it, pass it along to Angela and the training team, and make sure it was addressed. 2 years into Julian's tenure, Skyrise Airlines was profiled in a Harvard Business Review case study titled Culture Change at Altitude: How Julian Cross Transformed Skyrise Airlines. The case study detailed the acquisition, the changes Julian had implemented, and the results. It was used in business schools across the country as an example of how leadership and culture could drive organizational performance. Julian was invited to speak at conferences, to share his story, to talk about what he had learned. And while he was not naturally comfortable in the spotlight, he did it because he believed the message was important, that accountability mattered, that culture mattered, and that if you were willing to invest in people, they would reward you with excellence. But Julian never forgot why he had done all of this. It was not just about running a successful airline. It was about making sure that no one else had to experience what he had experienced, that no one else had to sit in a seat and hear someone say, "People like him do not belong." And every time Julian flew on a Skyrise plane, every time he saw a flight attendant treat a passenger with kindness and respect, every time he heard from a customer who said they felt valued, he knew it had been worth it. In the 3rd year of Julian's leadership, Skyrise Airlines won the J.D. Power Award for customer satisfaction in the regional airline category. It was a huge milestone, a recognition that the changes Julian had implemented were not just cosmetic, but substantive. The award ceremony was held in Los Angeles, and Julian attended with his wife Nadia and his leadership team. When Skyrise's name was announced, the room erupted in applause, and Julian walked to the stage to accept the award. He stood at the podium, looking out at the audience of industry executives and media, and he thought about how far he had come. Not just in the 3 years since he had bought Skyrise, but in the 47 years since he had been born on the south side of Chicago, the youngest son of a single mother who had worked 2 jobs and told him that if he worked hard enough, he could be anything he wanted. "Thank you," Julian said, holding the award. "This is an incredible honor, and it belongs to every single person at Skyrise Airlines, to the pilots who fly our planes safely, to the mechanics who keep them running, to the gate agents and flight attendants and customer service reps who show up every day and treat people with dignity and respect. This award is yours. You earned it." He paused, and then he said something he had not planned to say. 3 years ago, I flew on a Skyrise plane as a passenger, and I had an experience that made me realize how far the airline industry had drifted from the values that should matter most. Respect, dignity, fairness. I bought this company because I wanted to change that, not just for myself, but for everyone who flies, and I am proud to say that we have done that. We have proven that you can treat people well and still run a successful business, that you can invest in culture and still be profitable, and that doing the right thing is not just good ethics, it is good business. So thank you for this recognition. And to everyone in this room, I hope Skyrise can be a model for what is possible when you put people first. The applause was thunderous. Julian stepped down from the stage, and for the rest of the evening he was approached by executives from other airlines, by investors, by consultants, all of them wanting to know how he had done it. Julian answered their questions, but he also knew that the real answer was simple. You cared, you invested, you held people accountable, and you did not give up even when it was hard. If you found this story meaningful, if it challenged your assumptions about power, accountability, and what it takes to create real change, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because stories like this are not just about one man or one company. They are about the possibility of transformation when someone refuses to accept the world as it is. In the 4th year of Julian's leadership, he started to think about what came next. He had accomplished what he set out to do. Skyrise was profitable, it was well regarded, and it had become a model for the industry. But Julian was not an airline guy. He was a tech guy, an investor, someone who thrived on building new things, not running established ones, and he was starting to feel the pull of other projects, other opportunities, other ways to make an impact. He talked to Nadia about it, and she encouraged him to think about his exit strategy. Not because she wanted him to step away, but because she knew that Julian was happiest when he was building, not maintaining. Julian started quietly exploring options. He talked to private equity firms about a potential sale. He talked to other airlines about a merger. And he talked to his leadership team about the possibility of an employee ownership model, where the people who worked at Skyrise would actually own the company. Of all the options, the employee ownership model appealed to Julian the most. It aligned with his values, it would ensure that the culture he had built would be sustained, and it would give employees a direct stake in the company's success. But it was also complicated. Structuring an employee ownership plan for an airline required legal expertise, financial engineering, and buy-in from unions and regulators. Julian hired a team of advisors to explore the feasibility, and over the course of 6 months, they put together a proposal. The proposal was this: Julian would sell Skyrise to an employee stock ownership plan, or ESOP. The ESOP would be funded through a combination of company profits, external financing, and Julian taking a portion of the sale price in the form of a note that would be paid off over time. The employees would own the company collectively, with shares distributed based on tenure and compensation, and the board of directors would be elected by the employees, ensuring democratic governance. It was an ambitious plan, and there were risks. ESOPs were more common in manufacturing and service industries than in airlines, but Julian believed it could work. He presented the proposal to the Skyrise board, which he had restructured to include employee representatives, union leaders, and independent directors. The reaction was cautiously optimistic. The board liked the idea in principle, but they had questions about the financial viability, the regulatory hurdles, and the transition process. Julian spent the next 3 months answering those questions, refining the plan and building consensus. And in the spring of his 5th year as CEO, the board voted unanimously to approve the ESOP proposal. The transition took another year. There were negotiations with the unions, filings with the Department of Labor, and a complex financing arrangement involving several banks. But in the spring of Julian's 6th year as CEO, the deal closed. Skyrise Airlines became employee-owned, with Julian retaining a small equity stake and a seat on the board, but no longer serving as CEO. Keisha Monroe, the COO who had been instrumental in the operational turnaround, was promoted to CEO, and Julian, for the first time in 6 years, stepped back. The announcement was covered widely in the media. Business publications hailed it as a groundbreaking move, a rare example of a billionaire using his wealth to create a more equitable business model. Labor advocates praised Julian for empowering workers. And employees at Skyrise, many of whom had been skeptical of Julian when he first took over, were ecstatic. They owned the company now. They had a say in how it was run, and they had Julian Cross to thank for it. Julian did not feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had done what needed to be done and who was ready to move on to the next challenge. He returned to Crosstech Solutions, the company he had started decades earlier, and threw himself into new projects. But he stayed involved with Skyrise, attending board meetings, offering advice, and flying on the airline regularly. And every time he flew, every time he saw a flight attendant treat a passenger with respect, every time he heard from an employee who said they felt valued and empowered, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had taken something broken and made it better, and that was enough. 7 years after Julian had walked into Skyrise headquarters as the new CEO, the airline was thriving. It had expanded its route network, added new aircraft to the fleet, and consistently ranked at the top of customer satisfaction surveys. Employee retention was the highest in the industry, and the ESOP model, once seen as a risky experiment, was being studied by other companies as a potential blueprint. Julian had proven that it was possible to do well by doing good, that you could treat people with dignity and still run a profitable business, and that accountability, when taken seriously, could transform an entire organization. On a Tuesday evening in late September, 7 years after the flight that had started it all, Julian boarded a Skyrise plane at O'Hare, bound for Seattle. He was sitting in economy again, by choice, in seat 32B. The flight attendant who greeted him was a young black woman named Tasha, who smiled warmly and asked if he needed anything before takeoff. Julian said he was fine, and Tasha moved on to help other passengers. The plane took off, and Julian opened his laptop, working on a presentation for a board meeting. About an hour into the flight, Tasha came by with the beverage cart. "Can I get you anything to drink?" she asked. "Water, please," Julian said. Tasha handed him a bottle of water and a cup of ice, and then she paused. "You are Julian Cross, right? I thought I recognized you." Julian smiled. "I am. I just want to say thank you. I started working for Skyrise about 3 years ago, right after you bought the company, and it has been the best job I've ever had. The training, the benefits, the way we are treated, it is all because of you. So thank you." Julian felt his throat tighten. "You are welcome. But it is not because of me. It is because of people like you who care about doing the job right. Keep it up." Tasha smiled and moved on, and Julian sat there, looking out the window at the clouds, and thought about how far he had come. From a kid on the south side to a billionaire who had bought an airline to prove a point. It was an absurd story, the kind of thing that seemed too ridiculous to be true, but it was true, and it had mattered, not just for Julian, but for thousands of people who worked for Skyrise and for the millions of passengers who flew on the airline every year. He had taken a moment of discrimination, a moment of being dismissed and devalued, and he had turned it into something that made the world a little bit better, and that, more than the money or the success or the recognition, was what made Julian proud. 10 years after the acquisition, Julian was invited to give a commencement speech at his alma mater, Northwestern University. He stood on the stage in front of thousands of students and their families, and he told the story of Skyrise. He told them about the flight, about the comment, about the decision to buy the airline and the years of work that followed. And he told them why it mattered. The world is full of moments where you have to decide whether to speak up or stay silent, Julian said. Whether to accept the way things are or to fight for the way things should be. And I am here to tell you that the fight is worth it, not because you will always win, not because it will be easy, but because the alternative, staying silent, accepting injustice, letting discrimination go unchallenged, that is not an option, not if you want to live a life that matters. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. I bought an airline because I refused to accept being treated as less than, and in doing that, I learned something important, that accountability is not just about punishing bad actors. It is about creating systems that prevent harm in the first place. It is about investing in people, in training, in culture. It is about setting standards and holding everyone, including yourself, to those standards. And it is about understanding that the work is never done. You do not fix a culture problem once and move on. You have to be vigilant every single day, making sure that the values you care about are being lived. The students applauded, and after the ceremony dozens of them came up to Julian, shaking his hand, asking for advice, telling him their own stories of discrimination and struggle. Julian listened to all of them, and he told them the same thing he had learned over the years, that they had power, even when it did not feel like it, that their voices mattered, and that if they were willing to fight, to document, to hold people accountable, they could change the world, maybe not all at once, maybe not in dramatic ways, but incrementally, persistently, until the world looked a little more like it should. 15 years after the acquisition, Julian was 72 years old, semi-retired, and living in a house on Lake Michigan with Nadia and their 2 grandchildren, who visited often. Skyrise Airlines was still thriving, still employee-owned, still a model for the industry. Julian had long since cashed out his remaining equity stake, donating most of the proceeds to scholarship funds and community programs. He did not need the money. He had more than enough. What he needed was to know that the work he had done had made a difference. And every year, on the anniversary of that flight, Julian would book a ticket on Skyrise, sit in economy, and fly somewhere. It was his way of remembering, of honoring the moment that had changed his life and the lives of thousands of others. On one of those flights, 15 years after it all began, Julian was sitting in seat 32B again, reading a book, when the flight attendant stopped by his seat. It was Tasha, the same woman who had thanked him years earlier. She was older now, a senior flight attendant, and she recognized him immediately. "Mr. Cross," she said, smiling. "Good to see you again." "Please, call me Julian. And good to see you too. How have you been?" "I have been great. I am actually a union rep now, serving on the board. It has been an amazing experience getting to help shape the company." "That is wonderful. I'm glad you are involved." Tasha hesitated, then said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret it? Buying the airline, Going through all that? Julian thought about it for a moment. No, I do not regret it. It was hard, and it was expensive, and there were times when I wondered if I was making a mistake, but I do not regret it, because it mattered. It made a difference, and that is all any of us can hope for. Tasha nodded, her eyes bright. Well, for what it is worth, it made a difference to me, and to everyone I work with, so thank you. She moved on, and Julian sat there, looking out the window at the sky, and felt a sense of peace. He had done what he set out to do. He had taken a moment of injustice and turned it into a force for change. He had proven that accountability was possible, that culture mattered, and that one person, if they were willing to fight, could make the world a little bit better. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. Share this story with someone who needs to know that change is possible, that accountability is worth fighting for, and that the moments when we feel most powerless are often the moments when we have the most potential to transform not just our own lives, but the systems and structures that shape all of our lives. 20 years after the acquisition, Julian Cross passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his family. The obituaries noted his contributions to technology, his philanthropy, his role in transforming Skyrise Airlines. But the thing people remembered most was the story of a man who was dismissed, who refused to stay silent, and who used his resources to hold an entire company accountable. The story became legend, retold in business schools and boardrooms and family dinner tables. It became a reminder that power, when used responsibly, could be a force for good. And it became a challenge to everyone who heard it. What will you do when you are dismissed? When you are treated as less than? Will you stay silent, or will you fight? Julian's legacy lived on in the thousands of employees who owned Skyrise, in the millions of passengers who flew on an airline that treated them with dignity, and in the countless people who heard his story and were inspired to speak up, to hold systems accountable, to fight for a world where everyone, regardless of the color of their skin or the size of their bank account, was treated with respect. And in the end, that was the greatest acquisition Julian Cross ever made. Not an airline, but a belief that change was possible, that accountability mattered, and that one person, if they cared enough and fought hard enough, could make a difference that would last long after they were gone.